Over the past month or so, I think many people have been concerned about the war between the US, Israel, and Iran, a conflict that has shaken the global situation. Today, I'd like to start with this topic, but from a different angle. I think war really serves as a kind of stage, a platform, if you like, where you can see just how astonishing, how formidable human invention can be in this area. In this war, you see all kinds of different weapons. I don't know if you've been following the news, but in the upper left corner here, that's the Moab, the mother of all bombs. It's the most powerful bomb in the conventional arsenal. Even just to drop it, they need a C-130 Hercules transport plane because it's too heavy and too large. This mother of all bombs is the strongest in the conventional category. If you want to go beyond that, you have to step into unconventional weapons. Nuclear weapons, for example, that's pushing things to the limit. Next to it is the bunker buster bomb. As you know, Iran has many underground missile cities, underground nuclear facilities. The bomber that drops these bunker busters is the B-2. And that picture down on the lower left, and that one there, that is a torpedo. What you're looking at is the Mk-48, a heavyweight torpedo. You might still remember in the Indian Ocean, an Iranian frigate that had just finished joint exercises with India was returning to Iran when a US submarine sank it en route. That frigate wasn't a major warship, and it wasn't particularly advanced. A missile would have been enough to take it out. With a missile, you'd at least give the crew a chance to escape. But they actually used this heavy torpedo. You can find the footage on YouTube. The ship went down very fast. By the time Sri Lanka's old vessels arrived, the ship had already sunk. So why use a heavyweight torpedo against it? The story is that on board the US submarine that day, a Los Angeles-class sub, there were two Australian naval officers undergoing training. Australia bought nuclear submarines from the US, and in doing so, they tacitly agreed that if anything happens at the first island chain in the Pacific, Australia would join the fight. So inside that submarine that day, it was effectively combat training as well. And next to that, another impressive one. It's called the graphite bomb. They threatened to bomb Iran's power plant with it. Notice, it's not a weapon that harms civilians because they noticed one phenomenon. In some rural areas, in places with very few people, the electricity usage was surprisingly high. That usually means there are nuclear facilities behind it, or maybe military installations. So the US demand their threat to bomb the power plant. But if you actually destroyed the plant, that would be terrible. It would affect many people and civilian lives. So what is this graphite bomb? The moment it's deployed, the graphite itself causes massive short circuits, which knocks out power transmission. But the power plant itself and the generating equipment are not destroyed. You can see, isn't that remarkable? Actually, these warfare technologies, take US drones, for example, the Lucas drone. Then there are unmanned speedboats, unmanned vessels. In the lower left corner, you can see one called Starshield. That's also from SpaceX. Starlink is for civilian use. Starshield is for military use. So if you take apart the nose cones of those drones, you'll find receivers inside, then those tap into Starshield for navigation. And in the upper right corner, that one is a laser cannon. Actually, since around 2023, one thing that's become very popular is the so-called saturation attack. You use cheap weapons, drones, for instance, or some inexpensive missiles. And here's the thing, the missiles used to shoot them down are far more expensive. You've probably heard the 1 to 100 ratio, meaning the value of one interceptor missile is 100 times that of one drone. So while the enemy is spending pennies, you're getting drained dry. So you can see in this conflict, you're seeing a lot of very cheap weapons. So from all of these weapons here, from every single one of them, you can really see that the technology behind them is quite advanced, remarkably advanced. Someone once said, every weapon humans have invented has eventually been deployed on a battlefield. And in fact, throughout the history of war, weapons have gone through several, three major revolutions, you could say. Let me walk through them as a kind of framework. If someone asked you, in all of history, which was the greatest empire? You might say the Mongol Empire, and you'd be right, because across the vast expanse of Eurasia, the Mongol Empire stretched across an enormous swath of the continent. Why were they so formidable? The Mongols' greatest strength was their cavalry. I think in this painting, when I found this image, I felt that the person who painted it really understood the Mongol cavalry. Why? Because one of the Mongols' deadliest assets was their bow, the famous recurve bow. See how both ends curve outward. Compared with bows of the 13th century, it was 3 or 4 times more powerful. At close range, it could pierce armor. The other thing was the stirrup, the foothold you step into when mounting the stirrup. The Mongols didn't invent the stirrup, but they pushed its use to the limit. Why is that? Well, because of the stirrup, the rider could actually stand up on his horse's back and from there shoot arrows in a full 360 degrees all around him, pinning his opponent down. And combined with that incredibly powerful bow, they had a famous tactic called the Parthian shot. So don't ever assume they're beaten just because they turn and flee and go chasing after them, because they'll spin right around in the saddle and put an arrow straight in you. That's why in the 13th century, the Mongols swept across everything. No one could stand against them. So what was the first weapons revolution? It was gunpowder, applying gunpowder to military use. That gave us firearms and also artillery. So if someone asks you which was the largest empire by sheer area, it wasn't the Mongols. By area, and you know this one well, it was the empire on which the sun never set, the British Empire. In history, by total area, the British Empire was the largest. That was the first revolution in warfare and in weapons. If someone says to you rare, medium rare, or well done, what comes to mind? You'd probably think someone's teaching you how to grill steak, but actually this is military jargon, a technical term. It refers to one major country, namely the United States. If the US ever came under nuclear attack, these are the response options on the table: rare, medium rare, or well done. What they're really talking about isn't steaks, it's the earth. So if you're hit by a nuclear strike, what's the response? Mutually assured destruction or some other kind of reply. So the second revolution in weapons history was the invention of the nuclear bomb. After the nuclear bomb was invented, it wasn't long before two were dropped on Japan. And America has remained extremely powerful. Even today, nuclear weapons have two distinctive features. First, you need nuclear fuel. And that nuclear fuel is fundamentally hard to obtain. For instance, Iran today desperately wants to become a nuclear power, but refining and obtaining that fuel is not easy. On top of that, there's the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So from 1945 to today, only 10 countries possess nuclear weapons, that is, nuclear capability. One thing to note, the last two added, I've marked their dates here. I don't know if you can see. Uh, the last two countries to join the nuclear club, the latest one was North Korea in 2006, and the one before that was Pakistan. Today's gathering has a theme, and it's called Machine Killers or Killer Robots. Robots in everyday life are already affecting everyone in many ways. For example, here in the upper left, that's Waymo. Have any of you ridden in one over there? In LA downtown, for example, you'll see them soon enough. Those self-driving taxis. Waymo is easy to recognize. Sensors all over the roof and sides. And the one right next to it, that one's like the ones they use at Shake Shack. Those little robots that go around delivering documents and delivering food to people. Some robots, for example, the Optimus, which is Tesla's. There's been recent news in the US. They've started putting it behind the counter. For instance, there's a place in LA called Diamond Bar. Their city hall has one of these robots. You walk up and it asks you what it can help you with. Robots are even helping with law enforcement. A few days ago, I saw this vehicle. I don't know if you've been following this technology. It's called the Cybercab. Now, Waymo belongs to Google, and the Cybercab belongs to Tesla. So I have to ask a question. If there's nothing special about it, it's just a self-driving taxi, then what's so special about the Cybercab? Have you noticed? Well, I actually saw one of them being test driven out on the street. And this is the special thing about it. It has no steering wheel at all, and no pedals either. If you think of the Dragon capsule, SpaceX's spacecraft that takes people to the International Space Station, it's basically the same idea. You get on board and there's just a touchscreen, in there. No steering wheel at all. So if something goes wrong, you wouldn't know what to do. Today we're talking about killer robots. Killer robot. That's actually the colloquial term. What's the technical name? It's lethal autonomous weapon, LAW. Lethal and autonomous weapons. As the name suggests, it's a weapon, but it has two key elements. First, it's equipped with lethal weaponry. And the second element, it's autonomous. We'll get to that in a moment. So the killer robot is defined by these two traits. First, it carries lethal weapons, and second, it acts autonomously. Now, in your mind, what does a killer robot look like? Something like this. A while back, there were movies, Terminator or RoboCop. You've seen the type. But those are all fiction. Something closer to reality would be, for example, Big Dog, the one with a gun mounted on top of it, or else some of those robots that run along on tank-like tracks. But you might say, no, the robots I saw on TV, those killer robots aren't like that. They look like this. At the Spring Festival Gala recently, I saw these killer robots, ones that can throw punches. Actually, humanoid robots may not be the most advantageous form because two legs are never going to outrun four legs. And if the terrain is rough, I don't think they'd be as stable as tracked vehicles either. Besides the Iran war, there's another war going on in Eastern Europe that's been raging for over 4 years now. That's the Russia-Ukraine war. Last year, there was actually a scene just like this that played out. You had a group of Russian soldiers, and they surrendered. They gave themselves up to one of the enemy units, but that unit didn't have a single living person in it. They were all robots. I don't know if you saw the news. I saw it on YouTube. I'm not sure if you can still find it. Here's what happened. A Ukrainian drone flew over a trench and spotted some Russian soldiers. Some of them fired at the drone. Not long after, a vehicle showed up. You can see it on the bottom right of the screen. What was that vehicle? It was actually a bomb, a four-wheeled bomb. It drove right up to the trench, intending to wipe them all out at once. But the Russian soldiers saw it and raised a white flag, signaling surrender. Then another vehicle equipped with a machine gun came up, disarmed them, and escorted them back to a POW camp. Can you believe that's even possible? If you've been following the news, you know that in these 4 years, Ukraine has become a military powerhouse, especially in unmanned systems, unmanned aircraft, unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned combat vehicles, unmanned naval vessels. The unmanned vessels are particularly famous. Why? Because they've kept the Black Sea Fleet in check, Russia's Black Sea Fleet. When controlling these unmanned machines, they usually use what's called first-person view, that is, first-person vision. What the aircraft sees, what the camera sees, is what you see. Like in the image you're looking at, the operator, the controller, even what he sees is exactly what the drone's camera is capturing. Starting from late 2024 on the Ukrainian battlefield, they began implementing what's called coordinated combat. A single soldier, a single individual, doesn't just control the ground vehicles, he can also simultaneously control aerial drones. So there's surveillance, like the earlier example, he spots the Russian soldiers, then can dispatch a bomb-carrying vehicle to take out the enemy. You can see this is coordinated combat, letting a single soldier control unmanned weapons across sea, land, and air. On top of that, over these few years, artificial intelligence has been developing on the battlefield, making the effectiveness even more formidable, the effectiveness of using robots. Why? Because AI can take massive amounts of sensor data, huge volumes of data, and digest and analyze it, assess the battlefield situation, and then offer options for action. So have you noticed in recent months, the US military looks pretty impressive? For example, the capture of Maduro, done in a few hours overnight, and they got him. Now in Central and South America, Venezuela counts as a regional military power. But just like that, the capture succeeded. I'll give you more examples and you'll understand. I wonder if any of you have seen this movie. It's called Zero Dark 30. Some people mistakenly think that if you want to watch war movies, this is one of the top 10. What does Zero Dark 30 mean? The Chinese title, I think you already know. Usually for military operations, they pick the hours between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. because the body's circadian rhythm tells us that most people between midnight and 3 a.m. are at their most vulnerable, their sleepiest. So 0:30 means 12:30, an operation at 30 past midnight. There's one scene in it that goes something like this. This female CIA analyst, this woman, manages to track down bin Laden, who had been hiding out in Pakistan. But her superiors keep delaying action. No action. Why? because they're afraid of a diplomatic incident. She keeps asking, how certain are we that bin Laden is there in that compound? This scene, the CIA analyst goes to her boss's door every day and writes a number. Like today, she writes 21 days. It's been 21 days since they found the compound and still no action until what? 159 days. Over 4 months with no action. Finally, the operation went ahead. In this Iran war, the most striking thing was the first day. On day one, they took out Khamenei. And it wasn't just him. On that very first day, they had already taken out 48 of their most senior military generals, along with a number of other important leaders. Remarkable, truly remarkable. How could they accomplish this? Beyond the precision of the weapons, look at the upper left, Khamenei's residence. A precision strike, right? The building collapsed, and several deep holes because they used bunker buster munitions. Meanwhile, the surrounding buildings were not destroyed. So what's actually happening here? They use extensive surveillance, street cameras, for example, massive surveillance, and AI to analyze it all. They confirm all the targeted individuals are on site, then decide whether to strike at that moment. And when they do strike, what weapon? You may have heard of one called Blue Spear, Blue Sparrow. This weapon is very unusual. Why? A normal missile, once launched, flies forward, but this one flies upward. It punches out to the edge of the atmosphere, the edge of space. Why does it do that? First, there's less drag at the edge of space, so it has much longer range. When it comes back down to ground level, re-entering the atmosphere, it dives so fast that interception becomes very difficult. Understand? There's actually another reason. Because look, this is day one of the war, the early stage of the conflict. You don't yet know how much of Iran's air defense has been suppressed or destroyed. So they chose this weapon for exactly that reason. You know, radar, no matter how it looks from the outside, inside it has an antenna that rotates 360 degrees. The principle is that simple. You emit signals outward. They bounce off something and come back, and now you know what's out there. It scans 360 degrees, right? But most radars have a blind spot. That blind spot is the zenith, directly overhead. You rarely see a radar sweeping straight up. Understand? So this Blue Sparrow's special feature is it comes in right at the zenith, straight down on top of you. So why on day one? What I want to show you is all that intelligence, the analysis of it, the timing, the weapon operations, all of it was filtered through AI to inform the decision. The result is obvious. All right. So in the face of all these unmanned weapons, all these drones, there are actually countermeasures too, ways that people have found to deal with them. Can you see what this image shows? Look at this city. Doesn't it look like there's a spider web over it? This is a town in eastern Ukraine. What are those? You see, when one of these drones is sent up into the sky, the way it works is that it keeps in constant contact with its operator, and it does that through radio waves. How do you counter it? You send a jamming signal, an electronic jamming system. Once contact is lost, you can't control it anymore. Understand? So how do you solve that problem? How do you solve it? They use fiber optic cables to tether the drone. That way it's not affected by radio jamming. And through the fiber, you can transmit the same signals. First, control of the drone. Second, the video feed. You can still operate it from a first-person view. Do you see what I mean? And those fiber cables are very long, tens of kilometers. Each one is tens of kilometers. After the target is destroyed, the fiber stays behind on the battlefield. Over time, the whole battlefield looks like a spider web. That's what those fibers are. If you know fiber optics, it doesn't break easily. But as you can imagine, there are real problems with it. Beyond all that fiber being left behind on the battlefield, there's the fact that no matter how long it is, it's only tens of kilometers. So how do you solve that? How do you really solve the jamming problem? A few weeks ago in Foreign Affairs magazine, there was an article. And the man who wrote it is actually quite well known. This is someone who was a four-star general and who also served as the former director of the CIA. He wrote an article about the autonomous battlefield. And what does he mean by that? Well, here's what he said. In the end, whether or not you win a war doesn't really come down to how many drones a country happens to have or how many unmanned weapons it's got. What it truly comes down to is how those unmanned weapons make their decisions. If when you've detected the enemy, before firing, you still need a human, a soldier, to press the firing button, that operation, that reaction is already too slow. Do you understand what I mean? So look at Ukraine today. The interceptor on the left was developed by Ukraine, which is now helping Gulf states deal with Iran's drones. On the right are drones invented by the US. What's special about these drones? First, they're AI guided. Their pilot is AI. That is, when you launch one, you've given it a mission and it will carry out that mission. When you send it into the air, what do they expect? That contact will be lost quickly because of jamming. But because you've given it an order, it will execute. How? It will autonomously seek out the target and destroy it. After that, several scenarios are possible. First, what? The target it was looking for has already been destroyed. Then it will safely return. Or what? It finds another target. Once its target is destroyed, it finds another target on its own, finds another target, and then destroys it. Or what? Or you reestablish contact with the drone and change its orders or give it a different command. Do you understand what I mean? Simply put, once you've put it in the air, it executes the order on its own. At the moment of dropping the bomb, you don't have to press anything again. It carries out this kind of order by itself. Are you following? I think this is exactly where the problem lies. Because traditionally, with so-called killer robots, there has always been a red line. What is that red line? At the final moment, when the decision to fire is made, where does the control site? Is it with the soldier operating it? Or do you hand it over to AI to decide? That's the red line. That's the trigger. And what did we just see? Because of how the battlefield has evolved, they've developed these drones, these unmanned systems, and to deal with jamming signals, they made this arrangement. Once you launch it, it executes the mission on its own. AI is its navigator, understands. Some people will ask, how is that even acceptable? Once it's up there, it finds its own targets and opens fire on its own. Does it know who it's targeting? Does it know whether it's right or wrong? Is it acceptable? But you have to understand that in 4 years of war between Russia and Ukraine, what does Ukraine want most? To win the war. Whether it's moral, whether it's appropriate, leave that to the academics to debate. Understand. So little by little, that red line has been crossed. And that has produced what we just talked about. The killer robot's two defining traits. First, equipped with lethal weapons, guns, bombs, whatever. Second, capable of autonomous execution. And the boundary keeps getting blurrier and blurrier. Getting blurrier. If you follow the news, recently there's been an AI company in a lawsuit with the US Department of Defense because they're very firm. They believe that AI on the battlefield can only be allowed to go so far. They think it shouldn't be allowed to act autonomously. The Defense Department, of course, says we can't work with a company like that, so they canceled the contract, and now it's in court. So what can you see? This is the trend. And I believe this represents the coming third revolution in weapons of war. What makes it different from nuclear weapons? The materials are very easy to obtain. You can even use 3D printers to print these weapons. You may have heard a recent news story, Beijing banning certain people, banning drone flights, banning drone modifications. It's very simple. All you need is to build a drone and strap explosives to it, and you've got a decapitation strike capability. So this is really quite different from nuclear weapons because here the materials you need are far more common, far more widely available, and much, much easier to spread around. And take Ukraine today. In fact, if you just go and look it up online, you'll find that they're now able to manufacture drones by the millions every single year. At the start of the war, they had almost no military industry. And now at this point, they can turn out drones numbering in the millions in just a single year. All right, you might ask, these weapons revolutions, the development of these weapons, what does it have to do with us? In the book of Revelation, in the Bible, there are descriptions of future disasters. While we were singing earlier, I had a thought because the Lord has saved us and he will save us still. He saved us from sin and he will save us from disaster as well. Speaking of future disasters, one of the things mentioned is the massive loss of life. This refers especially to two moments. The first is the opening of the seals, the opening of the early seals. As it says here, when the fourth seal was opened, I heard the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of the one riding it was Death. Hades followed with him. Authority was given to them to kill with sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts, killing a quarter of the people of the earth. Before that, there were three horses, a white horse, a red horse, and a black horse. That's actually an echo of what came earlier. The red horse representing the sword, that is war. The black horse, what does it represent? Famine. And there's plague too. I wonder these plagues might possibly even have some connection to the military. Take what you're seeing now, for instance. Take COVID-19. All along, from the very start, there have been certain people who didn't want anyone looking into where it really came from. But there's no shortage of evidence that it likely came from a laboratory. So, conventional weapons. We just talked about some unconventional weapons. Besides nuclear, there are also biological weapons. This passage talks about sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts killing a quarter of the earth. Now, the world has over 8 billion people, a quarter dying. Well, that's 2 billion people. China has 1.3 billion, the US just over 300 million. Even adding up the populations of the US and China, it still wouldn't reach that figure. Do you understand? Why would so many people die? The Bible also speaks of a great fire in that war. A third of the earth burned, all the grass burned, a third of the sea struck, a third of the sun, moon, and stars affected. I don't believe this means the sun and moon themselves have problems. Rather, it's the atmosphere. The atmosphere has been compromised. What could cause a third of the earth, a third of the sea, and a third of the atmosphere to be affected? I think it's very likely connected to nuclear war. Next week, we'll talk more about this aspect. Why? Because you might think the Bible is the Word of God, but the Bible is very old. Since the Bible is so ancient, how could it describe these modern terms? Understand? These modern situations, it can actually describe them. We can dig deeper into this next time. But at the very least, you'll remember that back in January and February, wasn't the US still going on about a certain topic? This idea of wanting to take Greenland in order to complete its so-called Golden Dome defense plan. Some people might think nuclear missiles fly east to west or west to east, but have you considered they can also fly northward across the North Pole? The route is much shorter. For example, certain airline routes today, flight routes, also cross over the Arctic. So all of this connects back to nuclear weapons. Recently, there have been many such things about nuclear war, nuclear missile interception, and so on. Coming back to that saying, every weapon humans have invented has eventually been used. And today's nuclear bombs are more than 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right. What about the killer robots you mentioned in the Bible, Revelation chapter 9? There's a description like this. It speaks of several angels sounding their trumpets, 7 angels in all. When the 6th angel sounded, he said a voice came from before God, from the 4 horns of the golden altar. And what did it say? It said to release the 4 angels who had been bound at the Euphrates River. And those 4 angels were released. They had been prepared for a specific year, month, day, and hour to kill a third of mankind. And the armies of horsemen numbered 200 million. I heard their number. The second time massive death is mentioned is right here, killing a third of mankind. If you do the math, first the 4 horsemen kill a quarter of humanity. The world goes from 8 billion to 6 billion, 2 billion dead. Then a third of the remaining 6 billion die, another 2 billion gone. By this point, half the world's population is gone. And let me tell you, at what point in time is this? This is only the halfway mark of the 7-year tribulation. The final disasters haven't even happened yet. The last 3.5 years haven't come. Speaking of those last 3.5 years, what does the Bible say? It says, if not for the sake of the elect, for the sake of Israel, if those days were not cut short, no flesh would be saved. So you realize the disasters in the earlier period, the scale of the killing is already severe. And the 4 seals we just mentioned, those happen shortly after the 7-year tribulation begins, after the white horse. And here, when the sixth angel sounds his trumpet, what does that mean? You could say, after the four horses, later there's an antichrist. The kingdom of the beast emerges. People are required to worship him, and dissenters are slaughtered. A killing of dissenters. And in this passage, you'll notice, besides killing a third of humanity, there are two other striking features. First, you notice it specifies a particular year, month, day, and hour. Very curious, it doesn't say where the soldiers come from, where they're going, what war they're fighting. Many people confuse this passage with Armageddon or other events, but it isn't. Look carefully. There are significant hints in the text. What does it say? It says it originates from four angels released at the Euphrates River. There's a connection to the spiritual realm. And the Euphrates is in modern day Iraq, also the region of ancient Babylon, back to that original place of rebellion. And notice this, a specific year, month, day, and hour, killing a third of mankind. Do you see it? It doesn't look like a war. It looks more like the execution of an order, like the execution of a command. Recently, Donald Trump, in a national address a few days ago, said something like this: in modern history, no war has ever lasted just a single day. The current Iran war has already gone over 30 days, a whole month. Modern wars never last a single day, let alone half a day. And here it specifies a particular day and a particular hour. So doesn't it look like the execution of a command? And finding targets to execute a command, that's very easy. For example, you may well have seen that recent piece of news, the one about Facebook, about Meta, and some of the other platforms, where the courts find them saying they were using algorithms, using all that data to work out exactly what people like, and then feed them just the right content to keep them hooked, to keep them addicted. Actually, with that kind of data, you can know exactly what people are doing online, what kind of person they roughly are, what they like to watch, their personal preferences, their political leanings, all of it. So it's very easy to identify targets. Another point worth mentioning, it says the cavalry numbered 200 million. In the world today, which country has a 200 million strong army? None. Understand? But if you think about the robots we just talked about, killer robots, having that many isn't hard at all. Why? 200 million. But is the goal to kill a third? A third would be 2 billion, one robot to 10 people. Understand? So it's absolutely possible. And what does that cavalry look like in the description? In the vision, the riders sit on horses wearing breastplates. Fire. Breastplates as red as fire, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. The horses' heads were like lions' heads. Like lions' heads. I know everyone's getting hungry and it's lunchtime. But lions' heads here isn't the Shanghai dish. Fire, smoke, and sulfur came out of the horses' mouths. These three things killed a third of mankind. The horses' power was in their mouths and in their tails. I don't know what that is. That's what the Apostle John saw back then. Personally, as I look around at the way things are developing right now, this current war between the US, Israel, and Iran, of course, there's still an awful lot we could take away from it, especially on the political side of things. For instance, what it means for Europe, what it means for NATO, and also for Israel's whole position in the Middle East. But all of that we'll have to leave for another day when we get the chance. But on the matter of weapons, what can we see? The US economy, US technology, US military power are all formidable. If you wanted to take on the United States, it seems the only option would be nuclear weapons. And when the US and the rival powers all step down together, you find there aren't many remaining powers. Maybe just Europe, understand? And when that happens, a hostile power will arise. The kingdom of the Antichrist will appear. He'll demand worship, refuse, and you die. That's the scene described under the sixth trumpet. I think the weapons part of the picture, and you can already see the early signs. So what lies ahead? Today I've tried through the lens of weapons or to tell you about this war. Next week we'll talk about what's ahead. That's not just current events analysis. In the Bible, how does it describe what's coming? We'll see each other again next week, okay? That's all I have for today.